This is Adam King. He is our guest. We will be talking in a bit about apologetics. You're somewhat an expert on that, right?
I guess you might say so, yeah.
Okay,
I've been studying it, yeah.
We are first going to start with a game that I have seen people do. I got this idea from a podcast called Makeshift Project. So thanks to them for that. I can't necessarily recommend the podcast because I haven't listened much to it. I've just seen clips of it. So just if you want to listen to that, tread lightly. So basically how this is going to work is we have a list of Christian celebrities that we are going to draft. We get 5 picks, and then it is up to y'all to decide who won the draft. So I'll start. My first pick is going to be C.S. Lewis.
See, you just knew that.
Yeah.
All right, G.K. Chesterton.
Okay. I'm going to go with Charles H. Spurgeon on my second pick.
Augustine.
Okay, I had him. All right, third pick, going with the Gettys.
All right, so let me think. Isaac Watts, okay. So we're on fourth pick now. I'm gonna go with Bonhoeffer. I feel like that's a pretty solid pick. Martin Luther.
We'll keep
it
okay.
German.
All right, okay. All right, last pick. I'm gonna go with Paul David Tripp.
All right, I'm gonna go with John Piper.
Okay. I didn't say him. I had him on a list, but all right, messed that up. All right, so email thelordsarmypodcast@gmail.com to pick who you thought won that draft. All right, so we're going to move on to your interview.
All right.
So first question is, what is being an Army chaplain like?
Well, so right now I'm actually a chaplain candidate, so I'm stepping into the role of chaplain. So I've been in the Army for 5 years, and I was a human resources officer before, not anything related to chaplain. But yeah, being in the Army is cool in general. It's a brotherhood that is kind of formed based on the fact that you're willing to serve the United States Army. So that's a cool thing. And I watched your podcast with Chris talking about brotherhood, and it was making me think of how the Army is a brotherhood. You're willing to die for someone simply on the basis of the fact that you're a part of this brotherhood.
Yeah.
And that kind of plays into why I wanted to be a chaplain. I saw really cool things in the Army, but I also saw deep spiritual needs. And so I decided to go down chaplain candidate path, which just means I'm finishing all my qualifications before I become an actual chaplain, my Master of Divinity, pastoral service, stuff like that, before I become a chaplain. So right now I have been entrusted with going to a battalion, which is about 500 people, to take care of their spiritual needs, to have a service. I'm in the National Guard, so it's not like I'm doing it every day. It's only 1 week in a month. Yeah. But there's opportunity to counsel. There's opportunity to teach. For sure. Just this last weekend I was there, and I got to share a message on sleep. And I try and find things that are really relevant to the Army life, things that are, but that have spiritual implications for them. Yeah. So that really everyone there, whether they're a Christian or not, has an opportunity to hear the truth. That's a really cool thing too, is that I can witness to people without witnessing to them directly. It's right. Basically everyone can feel welcome at a service provided by a chaplain, and yet they're going to hear the gospel. So it's a really cool, sneaky way of sharing the gospel.
Kind of like a mother sneaking veggies into their child's dinner.
Yeah. And of course, they know that I wear a cross, so they'll know that I'm a Christian, and that I come from that perspective. But that doesn't necessarily deter people. Another cool thing about being a chaplain is that when someone comes to me and has a conversation, I don't have to tell their chain of command or anything, so they won't get in trouble for anything that they tell me. So if they're going through something really difficult, spiritually, in the home, financially, any of those things, they just want to talk to somebody. Yeah, they get to talk to me. and I don't tell anyone that. So it's between me and the Lord, and and so I get to be a listening ear for people. So it's just a really cool opportunity.
Yeah. What would you say are the similarities to being a pastor in the church?
Yeah, the big difference would be that, as far as just practical difference, being a pastor and being a chaplain, there are limitations to being a chaplain. Like I said, it's a pluralistic environment, which actually suits apologetics well, and the conversations well. But yeah, it's a pluralistic environment, whereas you come to a church and the pastor's teaching and preaching as if everyone in the room is a Christian. He's trying to exhort the brothers, the sisters, the mothers, to active living in their faith, to active discipleship.
Yeah.
Whereas I can't assume that in the Army context. So there's that big difference. I would say, the role of any pastor is to counsel, but there's a lot of counseling in the chaplaincy role, in any kind of Army or if it was a hospital chaplain. And when you're a chaplain, you're really dealing with like on the ground kind of needs. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap between what you discussed with Chris and the chaplain role. And I'm not saying that the pastors don't do that, but sometimes that's not their exclusive thing. They might be more focused on teaching than they are in counseling.
Yeah. Okay, so now on to the big subject of apologetics. I have a scripture to read here, just kind of what scripture has to say about sharing your faith and apologetics.
Yeah.
So this is 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. So that is 1 Peter 3:15. So my first question for you is, in a nutshell, what is apologetics?
Yeah, so apologetics, it basically means to make a defense or to give a defense. Well, the word apology, we think of an apology sometimes as a defense of something you've done, where a good apology is probably not so much of a defense. It's acknowledging that you've done something wrong. But just kind of the root word there, you get the idea of it's a defense. And it's a defense of the Christian faith. So, when we think about apologetics, you could have an apologetics of, any number of things, a defense of why someone would make a political choice or something like that. But when we think about apologetics, we think specifically about Christian apologetics, defending the basic tenets of the faith. And really, we'll get into this conversation a little bit, I think, but the idea that this is in some ways a doctrinal and like a mental task, an intellectual task. Yeah. It's about the mind. At least that's one avenue that people go down when they think of apologetics. I think we're going to talk a little bit about apologetics versus evangelism, and I think there'll be some fruitful discussion by comparing and contrasting those things to distinguish what apologetics is. But essentially, it's giving a reason for the hope that is in you. I'll add some context to that verse. This is in the context of suffering. So being able to give a reason for the hope that is in you, it helps you understand this is a hope. This is a belief about reality. It's not just an intellectual thing, though formal apologetics can kind of tend that direction. I think that apologetics has a broader scope, and it also overlaps a little bit with evangelism. Yeah. But it's a defense. So if you look at the early church history, it kind of helps you know what apologetics is by looking at some of the written apologies. And what they are is a defense against heresy. So teachings that are against the biblical worldview. I don't know. I might be getting ahead of some of the other questions, so I'll cut it short there and try to discuss some more stuff about apologetics as we go.
So how important would you say it is to learn apologetics?
Importance of apologetics is, I would say, is very important. And if we kind of relegate it to simply being a intellectual task where we're knocking down arguments from non-Christians, it kind of limits the importance of it, because people will say, well, I don't see how that being my job.
Yeah.
Whereas if you understand apologetics to be something that is necessary for a Christian, we can talk about that a little bit later, but something is necessary for a Christian when they're going through struggling to have a theological answer for the kind of attacks that Satan, that the world, that their own mind might come up against the Christian faith, to have a reasonable answer about who God is, about what his world is like. That's actually a task for a Christian that they need to be able to do, to have a mental reason to fall back on. And one of the discussions of apologetics is, of course, the problem of pain. Well, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why does God allow it? Well, that's a very personal thing when people are struggling with some suffering. So apologetics is very important, and it's important because of evangelistic reasons as well. It's not just for the Christian. I mentioned that first because it shows why it's important. But it's also important in evangelism because people who are outside of the faith have legitimate questions. And if we see those questions as legitimate, then we'll have a better foothold when we come to evangelizing them, sharing the gospel with them.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the problem of pain because in the first half of this episode, I actually went over that question. So I'm glad that you mentioned it because I thought that the first half of this episode really did relate to this second half. So in some cases, would apologetics be more than just defending our faith?
Yeah, I guess I kind of went into that a little bit. It's defending. I like tying it into counseling in the heart a little bit, and I'll just give a practical example of how this has played out in my life that hopefully will bring clarity to that. But there's a crossroads between a mental and intellectual reason and what's going on in a person's life. So someone who says, I've had someone say to me, I just can't believe in the Christian faith because it says that my uncle is a bad person and he's going to hell. I can't believe in a God that sends people to hell who's like my uncle. And I didn't know much about this person's uncle that they mentioned this to me. And but I understood immediately where the position they were coming from. They had a legitimate issue with the faith, and that they think that because their uncle is a good person, who we don't know much about his uncle, but he thinks his uncle's a good person. The idea that he would go to hell is something that he cannot stand. He cannot. It's a barrier, obstacle to his faith. So that is I see that immediately as not just an intellectual issue, but a heart thing. I don't like thinking about any of my close relatives ending up in hell. I don't like thinking about any of those issues either. It's something that cuts to my heart. To think that someone I love might not know Christ and then might go to hell. And so I have to have a reason that I give myself. It's not just for someone else, but a reason I give myself. I have to be able to search the scriptures and say, no, this is why I still believe in Christianity in this very awful scenario, in this very awful circumstance. Something that, So it's not just about defending in the sense of from an outsider. It's about defending internally as well. And it's about the heart. It's not just about the head.
Yeah. Okay. I like that answer. So what is the difference between apologetics and evangelism? You actually mentioned this question earlier.
Yeah. So I brought books up here for that question. You might not be able to see it, but this is Apologetics at the Cross. And it talks about kind of the overlap between those two. So the difference between apologetics and evangelism, when you think about evangelism, the purpose would be I'm sharing the gospel with somebody for the purpose of winning them over to Christ. Apologetics kind of is meeting barriers before you even get to that conversation. I think is the practical difference between the two. You're meeting the barriers, intellectual, the heart barriers, but they overlap because when you're talking about the reason for the hope that is in you, a defense, you're going to bring up the gospel. I mean, if you're not bringing up the gospel, then is it Christian apologetics? And so, in a sense, you are sharing the gospel when you're giving a defense. Some of the very specific and philosophical strains that these conversations can take may seem to take you far away from that evangelism, that task of evangelism. And I think that's why there is a distinguishment that we have to do. Can't think of the right word. You have to separate the two. And it's for practical reasons that you separate the two. But the goal of apologetics should be still arriving back at the cross. It should be arriving back at the gospel. And so there is a evangelical purpose to apologetics. And that's, again, going back to the helpful illustration that it's not just for non-Christians, it is also for Christians. What we need is the gospel as Christians. So it's not just to use an illustration that my pastor uses, it's not just a diving board that the gospel is not just a diving board that leads you into Christianity, but it's the pool in which you swim. There's definitely intersection between the two ideas. It's really a practical thing, I think.
I've heard it simply put that evangelism is invitational and apologetics is conversational. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I like that. Invitational. Yeah, it comes with an appeal when you're preaching the gospel to believe. Again, we're kind of going to get into some distinguishing things about apologetics too, about different methods. I think we're going to talk about methods. But some of the methods are kind of almost denigrating to the idea of apologetics in general, because they kind of make the appeal to faith rather than deal with the intellectual barriers. And so in some ways, I think apologetics turns into evangelism in some of the methods. And so, we can get there into discussion with methods.
I think that's the next question.
Is it the next question? Okay.
So out of all the methods of apologetics, which do you prefer? And I don't really know much about these methods. I just wrote down what the list was on Google, frankly. So the different methods are classical, evidential, presuppositional, reformed, and expository.
Yeah, well, I feel better knowing that you just pulled the list off of Google, because I did know a few of the terms immediately. The other ones I was like, I don't remember studying that. I know that they exist, but I just didn't know what each of them were.
Okay.
But classical, classical, evidential, presuppositional. I won't give a summary of all of them, but there's different methods to apologetics, and most of them have just kind of arisen out of history, and I imagine that there will be more that arise based on historical needs, or not historical at that point, on current issues. Issues that arise, I think, will warrant a different method. The way an age feels about certain things, the way a culture feels about certain things, will determine kind of your method. So I don't think there is one method that's better than the other. Classical, I believe, is giving proofs, very logical proofs for the existence of God. That's where they start typically, is logical proofs for the existence of God. And then from there, they work from that towards Christianity. Well, if God exists, well then, isn't this the best description of God? Evidential is giving evidences for the Christian faith. And so you might point to events, historical events, the life of Christ being one of them. A classic example of this is A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, how he came to faith by researching out the historical evidence for Christ. This is an evidential method, though many different kinds of evidences could be given. It doesn't have to be historical. Presuppositional, that is one that is, again, I think more towards the evangelism side.
Okay.
So it just means that faith presupposes reason. So until you have belief, you cannot come to Christ. So basically, you're not going to be able to solve issues of reason. You're not going to be able to solve the issues of intellect until you have a shifting in your faith and your allegiance. So a good example of this would be an atheist. If they have certain allegiances to ideas that aren't really based out of reason, but they are core beliefs about that individual holds, they will never come to an understanding of the Christian faith without first placing faith. I think there's some real truth to that idea, but it muddies the waters about what the task of apologetics is. And so presuppositional for me is not necessarily one of my favorites. I think it's the task of evangelism, and so I kind of prefer a mix. Reformed and expository, I don't know much about Reformed.
I would assume that it's a Calvinistic way of looking about apologetics, just from the name.
But yeah,
I could be totally wrong on that.
Yeah, Reformed is probably more a description of like different apologists than it is a method. I'm probably vastly wrong on that. Someone on the podcast can talk to me about that. But yeah, I'm not very sure. Expository, I think that has to do, I have a second book up here, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. So when you think about expositing, you're basically saying, here's the truths of Christianity, laying that out on the table, and making an appeal that way to the intellect or to the heart. So yeah, I think that's what expository is getting at there. And that's a good method. When we look at some of the more recent apologists, C.S. Lewis being a great example, he used, and just to talk about methodology in general, so yeah, it says, could you explain what your preferred method looks like? Yeah, I think that different methods are suited to different times.
Yeah.
So like at the beginning of church history, there was some a lot of nitpicking over language and stuff like that, which was extremely necessary for establishing the doctrine of the church. An apologetic against a heretic,
Yeah.
Whereas much of that is established now, and we understand that, though we do have current issues, and this will help us and understand what method is best used in the situation. So a current issue would be on the topic of gender, right? How do we deal with that barrier? People who identify differently because of their gender or have different gender identity.
Yeah.
The issue of that currently is existent in the world. We should have a reason for what we believe as Christians. So that requires knowing the culture. It requires knowing what the opposition actually is.
Yeah.
And so getting back to full circle to 1 Peter 3:18, do it with gentleness and respect. So much of what matters in apologetics is your demeanor. So as far as a method goes, whatever you want to categorize it, however you want to categorize your method, you want it to be that you have such a posture of humility, of grace and kindness towards someone that you are opposing. And there is that element of defense. You are opposing someone who is attacking the Christian faith. So yeah, whatever your method, it needs to be suited to the person, suited to what the issue is. And so yeah, I think that this can kind of, if you try and narrow yourself to one, you're kind of doing yourself an injustice. I think that C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, having read both their works pretty thoroughly, I think that they used many different methods. So like an example, C.S. Lewis, he writes a story about his own life. He writes an autobiography. In many ways, it's an apologetic.
Yeah.
He also writes a book about what it would be like for demons to tempt a person. Screw Tape Letters. So yeah. Great book. Yeah. He writes a book about what it would be like for people from hell to go up to heaven. This is the Great Divorce. What is it that is keeping them from heaven? And all of these, I would say that's more like a psychological method.
Yeah.
All these are different methods and separate books that he uses to make a defense for Christianity.
Yeah.
And he made a famous statement. I'm going to misquote it because it's so often misquoted, but basically that through Christianity, he can see everything else. By the light of Christianity, C.S. Lewis could see everything else.
That was the one about how he was in a shed and there was a beam of sunlight coming through the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when he stood in the beam, he could see the whole world around him. But when he stood outside the beam, he could just see the beam.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so, yeah, what we're trying to do as an apologist is really well summed up in that. Is it's getting a person from a place where there is a barrier to the Christian faith, and getting them to see how Christianity is the best explanation for their world. So it's about worldview. It's about how you see the world. So in many ways, it is about faith. I don't know if we're going to talk about faith and reason. I can't remember, but yeah. So,
do you have anything else you would like to say about apologetics, just
in
as
general?
a closing
yeah.
statement?
Is there any more questions on? Yeah.
No, that was the last question.
Yeah. So I'll talk about one more thing, since I kind of went down that direction. Is the idea of faith and reason. It's like a classic debate about apologetics, and so. Are we appealing to man's reason to get them to see the Christian worldview, or are we appealing to faith? And we talked a little bit about with presuppositionalism. But yeah, I think that C.S. Lewis, in making that quote and saying it that way, really helps see how it's both. You need the intellectual, you need the reason of a person to understand certain things about the Christian faith. But then it also has to fit in at the level of your soul, and in that it is an issue of faith. No intellectual reason, no word that I speak could actually get any person to shift from thinking one way to another. It has to be a moving of the allegiance from their set of beliefs to a different set of beliefs, and that is. So it involves both, and then there's been famous. Maybe if I'm ever on again, we can talk about the different people who have argued different ways, had different kinds of apologetics, but many of them will appeal directly to faith, and then many of them will appeal first to reason. But really, I think the summation of looking at the whole history is that it requires both. Yeah. And again, the method depends on the person. It depends on the time. It depends on what the issue is at hand. So, yeah.
Okay. If you would like to study on apologetics yourself, I have a few books to recommend. One is The Universe Next Door by James W. Sire, and then The Reason for God by Timothy Keller, Mere Apologetics by Alistair E. McGrath, and Tactics by Gregory
Kukul.
Okay.
Maybe I don't know.
Would you like to recommend any of the books you brought up?
Yeah. So those are. I haven't read any of those, I don't think. So it helps that I've been up here. Yeah. I brought a few books up here that I'm familiar with. Apologetics at the Cross, I already mentioned. Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. Telling a Better Story by Joshua Chatraw. But one thing that I would recommend as you're doing, a lot of these books are about apologetics. Reading an apologetic, a written defense is maybe more helpful in helping you understand what apologetics is and how to do it. I've found it more beneficial to read the apologetic works of C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, actually Athanasius. So reading a defense sometimes is better than reading about how to do a defense. So you can kind of adopt and adapt to your needs if you've read a few. So reading Miracles, Mere Christianity. I'm going to recommend like all C.S. Lewis because that's what I've read most of. Screw Tape Letters. Any of C.S. Lewis's works. Yeah. G.K. Chesterton, if I was actually, even though I'm a big fanboy of C.S. Lewis, if I was to say my favorite apologetic is written by G.K. Chesterton, and it's The Everlasting Man. That's my big one recommendation. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for being on the podcast, and that is all for today, folks. This was episode 4 of the Lord's Army Podcast.